Okay, hello everyone. I'm Kaitlyn Burnell. I have been in the industry about 7 years. Right now I'm at Naughty Dog, although the ideas for this talk were developed while I was still at CCP. So before I start, a quick spoiler warning. I will be spoiling a couple of plot moments. Chances are you've already heard of most of these, even if you haven't played these games, but fair warning. So before I launch into the meat of this talk, let me give a quick review of the major terms. Autonomy, competence, and relatedness are psychological terms used for increasing intrinsic motivation to play your game. And, well, why am I focusing on these three? There's actually quite a few statistics about how effective these three together are at increasing player retention. For instance, these stats from Immersive claim that MMO retention was much higher in games that provided these three psychological needs. In their study, 46% of players who had spent 1 month playing an MMO with autonomy, competence, and relatedness were still playing that MMO 9 months later. By contrast, 18% of players who had spent a month playing an MMO that they self-described as fun were still playing that MMO 9 months later. Autonomy, competence, and relatedness have strong statistical results. And they work in more than just games. They've proven effective in education, in sports, in the workplace. So what are they? Autonomy is feeling like you have options, like you're in control, feeling like you're responsible for the results of your own actions. For instance, why is Grand Theft Auto so popular? It's not because any one piece of the game is totally flawless. It's that you can do anything you want. Want to drive a fire truck? Okay, go drive a fire truck. Similarly, everyone likes making silly pictures in Photoshop because you can create anything, and part of Lego's appeal is just how open-ended it is. Competence. Competence is feeling like you're up to the task. Like the thing you're trying to make the character do is what the character actually does on screen. It's also associated with a feeling of mastery, the player feeling like they know the strategies and are good at the game now. For instance, people who never played a console game before will play Wii Sports because they feel like they're up to the task of swinging a Wiimote. On the flip side, people hate Microsoft Word's autocorrect because they think they intend to type is not what actually appears on the screen. The controls don't do what they intend. So Microsoft Word is a badly designed game. Now, there's actually a bit of a special case with competence where, statistically speaking, it has no effect without autonomy. Let's say I hand you a piece of chalk and tell you to write on a chalkboard. Probably all of you feel like, yeah, I have the skills to do this. But are you motivated? If I tell you to write the same line over and over, probably not. If I tell you to put anything you want on the chalkboard, yeah, now you've probably got some good ideas. Relatedness is all about human relationships, feeling like you belong, that you're part of something bigger, that you have peers who will look out for you, and that you're also responsible for their well-being. And despite relatedness being all about people, ironically, NPC interactions are more consistently effective at giving positive relatedness. Unlike other players who might just yell at you for being a noob, NPCs can every single time have the reaction of, wow, you're that guy who saved the whole town. I can't believe I'm meeting you. So to give a quick shorthand for these terms, autonomy is having options. Competence is feeling up to the task, and relatedness is connecting with people. So you might be asking, why wouldn't we just want to max out autonomy, competence, and relatedness? After all, you get a huge spike in player retention if you do, and some games do go this route. Take Farmville, for instance. You can plant crops in any pattern you want, giving you autonomy. The only skill is clicking, so no one feels a lack of competence. And your friends are relying on you to play and benefit from you playing, giving you relatedness. So does that make Farmville the pinnacle of game design? Now, don't get me wrong, it is very efficient at what it does, but let me make a case for deliberately denying the player autonomy, competence, and relatedness. I'm going to compare two different scenes where autonomy is taken away. In Portal, there's a scene where you have to destroy an inanimate box. And quite a few people, not everyone, but quite a few form a sort of emotional connection with this box. And so destroying the box is something they really don't want to do, breaking the player's autonomy. In Portal 2, there is a scene where, in order to advance the plot, you have to put the villain back into power. And a lot of people don't want to do this because they're angry with the villain, breaking the player's autonomy. Now, here's the interesting thing. People love Portal scene and hate Portal 2 scene. In both of these scenes, you have your autonomy taken away. But in one of these scenes, the villain is making you do this heinous act. And in the other, the game designer is making you do it. Which means, in one case, the player is angry with the villain, and in the other case, the player is angry with the game designer. Or alternatively, they might just end up feeling like they can't relate to the main character. Either way, you probably don't want the player hating your game design or hating your main character, but the player hating your villain? Actually, yeah, that's usually a writing success. Now, some of you are probably saying, whoa, hold on. Weren't we talking about autonomy? How did we end up talking about villains? In other words, how did we go from talking about a purely game mechanical concept to a purely narrative concept? So here's what's happening. You start with a piece of game design, in this case, one that takes away the player autonomy. This causes a powerful emotion in the player, anger at having their autonomy taken away. And then we use trickery to get the player to associate that emotion with the narrative and not the game design that caused the emotion in the first place. Now, this is a big deal. This is an emotional storytelling tool that exists only in games. But is this the only way to produce the emotions we want through game design? I mean, do we have to break autonomy? Because autonomy is something we really don't want to break. I mean, it triples our subscriber numbers. Could we maybe modify the scene a bit so that it doesn't actually break autonomy? What if there was some super secret way to save the cube in Portal? Would this be better? Well, there's a couple of problems with that. The first is newbies. Newbies aren't going to know there's a secret, and therefore they're still going to feel the autonomy loss. The second is that eventually, when the newbies go online and talk about this scene, they're going to hear, no, you did it wrong. You're supposed to save the cube. And now all of a sudden they feel incompetent. So now we're breaking two rules instead of just one. So, okay, wow, that didn't work. Do we really just have to break autonomy? Well, hold on. What if we just let people keep the cube? No secrets. Now, nobody loses autonomy or competence. But now you've completely changed the emotional tone of the scene. Why be angry at the villain anymore? Why be sad at the scene now? In short, if we want our game design to produce negative emotions to be harnessed in our narrative, then we need to break rules. So now that we know what makes Portal's scene effective, let's try to fix Portal 2's scene. The problem with Portal 2's scene is, why does the main character agree to the plans? Who's forcing her to do so? I mean, the main character gets ordered around by a potato. Why does she obey the potato? Why doesn't she just make her own plans? To fix this, what you need is a stronger authority figure, someone who can give the main character orders she can't refuse. Let's come back to Portal 1 now. Given that we already have our formula, a villain that takes away your autonomy, how can we improve the impact of this scene? Now, the funny thing about this scene is that it has no real impact on a certain percentage of the audience. Some people, when they play Portal, react, it's just an inanimate object. Sure, I'll incinerate it, no problem. It would be a very different story if the cube was instead a cute robot with personality and seeming intelligence. Now, the walls in Portal are covered in graffiti from past test subjects, leaving poems and tributes to the cube. What would happen if you let people write their own graffiti? What would happen if there were flowers in the scene that they could move around? Basically, give the players a small piece of autonomy. You're still breaking their autonomy. The player still has no control over the big things. They still have to kill the cube, but they do have some autonomy over what kind of send-off they give the cube and how much respect they pay, which theoretically will make them more engaged with the scene. So enough analysis about Portal. Let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture here. Some of you might be wondering, could we use the emotion produced by our game design to enhance something other than narrative? And the answer is yes, it could be used to emphasize a moral. Brenda Brathwaite, for instance, has games where you experience various historical atrocities, such as the slave trade from Africa to America. These games give you a history lesson. They probably get you closer to understanding what people were really feeling than any history textbook ever could, because you feel your human rights being taken away through gameplay. Alternatively, instead of narrative or morals, you could give people strong feelings about an abstract concept. This is most commonly seen in flash games that try to argue against a certain kind of game design. Let me give you an example. This is a screenshot from Super Press Space to Win. Now, the only controls in this game are the spacebar. The game never gives you a choice about anything. It's press space to buy a potion, and press space to walk, and choose a stat to upgrade when you only have one stat. A lot of people playing this game would say, oh, of course, this is a critique of linearity in RPGs. Although, actually, I think the message is a little ambiguous. I think another group of people would walk away concluding that linear RPGs actually do give them a lot of freedom, a lot of autonomy, and they just didn't notice it until you took that autonomy away. But I would argue that impacting narrative, impacting morals, and impacting an abstract thesis are all pretty similar. You're trying to convey a message, and you're using game design to make the player feel exactly the way you want them to feel. So, yes, you could manipulate player emotion around any external idea, but the tricks are basically the same. So, you might ask, what about not going external at all? Could we map a negative emotion from one piece of gameplay to another piece of gameplay? And the answer is yes. You could make people dislike a well-made part of your gameplay if you wanted to. For instance, this is the fairy from Zelda who yelled at you to stop what you're doing and listen to her, and nobody likes to be told to stop what they're doing, so most players hate her, and yet she's just a hint system. That's usually good game design. But why would you want people to hate a well-made part of your gameplay? And by the way, I'm not just being rhetorical here. In narrative, there are villains that audiences love to hate. Will there ever come a point in games where there are game mechanics that audiences love to hate? Video games are a young, evolving medium. Maybe someday audiences will clamor for villain game mechanics, but who knows? All right. So far, we've only really done a dozen variations on one example, and it produces one emotion. Let's expand our repertoire of emotions. Specifically, so far we've only been messing with people's autonomy. We can get different emotions by messing with their competence and their relatedness. For comparison purposes, breaking autonomy makes people feel controlled, makes them feel like a pawn, like they're being forced to do something against their will, which in turn makes them angry against authority, and all of these feelings together naturally make people want to start a rebellion. breaking competence has a very different effect. Instead of making people want to start a revolution, it makes them feel helpless, makes them want to admit defeat, makes them want to ask for help. Relatedness is a bit less one-dimensional. Psychologically speaking, relatedness is the opposite of loneliness. However, when someone is in a state of relatedness and you take that away, depending on how you remove relatedness, they might feel grief or loss or homesickness. So let's talk about breaking relatedness through game mechanics. There are several ways to break up an existing relationship. You can use death, killing a character the player cared about. You can use physical distance, have the player go on a long journey far away from friends and family. You could have the player's friends and peers reject the player. Of course, rejection can go both ways. You can make the player want to reject their friends and peers because it turns out their friends and peers are horrible, like maybe they're Nazis or something. And a couple of games use exactly that plot twist, your friends are secretly Nazis, but the vast majority of games just go for murder. And it's easy to criticize this and say that games should broaden their writing horizons, and they probably should. But is there a psychological reason why murder might be more effective? To answer this question, let me first go on a tangent about a psychological experiment. In this experiment, people were given electric shocks by someone in another room. And like any good scientific experiment, it was a double-blind test with two groups. One group is told that people in the other room were acting maliciously, that they know pressing the button will cause pain. The other group is told that there's someone in another room pressing a button, but they're totally innocent. They don't know they're hurting anyone. Now, it turns out malicious shocks really hurt. Innocent shocks don't. Well, the first one does, but the pain quickly drops off. So, why murder? Because it's malicious. The malicious act is going to cause more pain. So, if we are going to use a murder scene, how do we make sure we get the most emotional impact out of it? One of the more important points is making sure people care about the victim. And how do we do that? We use gameplay. We create a game mechanical relationship between the player and the victim. But don't skip narrative either. Remember how not everyone cared about the cube from Portal because to some people it was just an inanimate box. So how do we create game mechanical relatedness? In all the same way that relationships are built between humans. You want to create trust and respect between the NPC and the player. Enough trust that the player will happily do the character a favor because they know that character will return that favor. You want them to rely on each other. Maybe your main character can't fly and so relies on someone who can, and she in turn relies on the main character for brute force. You want them to feel like a peer to the player, like they are working together towards something bigger. So let's take a look at Eris now. Okay, like her or hate her, she's gotten more attention than any other video game death. Maybe there are game mechanical reasons for this. Let's analyze. She gives things to the player. Lore explaining how to defeat the bad guy. Goals that the player can do. At the same time, she needs your help, and she will often fight by your side, helping you. And finally, she dies halfway through the game, not in the ending credits, after the game ends, after the game mechanical contract is over. All the characters could die at the end of the game, and at some level the player would not care. But no, Eris dies in the middle of the game when she's still needed for more lore, more missions, and more gameplay. So, we've been talking about how to make people care about a character. So far, we've used relatedness. But what about using autonomy and competence? After all, autonomy and competence are good techniques to get people to care about pretty much anything. So, how do we increase player caring through autonomy? One way is to use user-created characters, like with The Sims, where players create lives and relationships for their characters. If you tell someone to dream up a set of characters and invent stories and relationships about them, they're going to be upset if you next tell them, okay, one of your characters is now dead. How do we increase player caring through competence? Make them feel like they rely on this character to be competent, like they're more competent at the game when they're using this character. And actually, Eris does a little bit of this. She is your healer, and when she dies, you lose all of her equipment and any experience you invested in leveling her up. So far, all of the examples I've used have been strictly linear. Let's take a moment to talk about how to extend these to non-linear storylines. Remember, all we're doing when using this technique is that we take a gameplay moment that produces a negative emotion in the player and fool the player into feeling that emotion about the narrative. All you need for this is a small piece of gameplay and a small piece of narrative that you can freely place anywhere in a non-linear setting. And you don't even have to pair the same piece of gameplay with the same piece of narrative. You can mix and match. Just make sure that you have one of each. What you don't ever want is intentionally bad gameplay that's not serving a purpose by driving narrative emotion. Let's go into some specific examples. How might we do murder in a non-linear setting? Find the character that the player seems to care about the most. The character that they're coming to rely on for help, for whom they're doing the most favors. And then you kill that character. A few games actually use exactly this trick already. I believe Far Cry 2 does, for instance. What about coercion, like in Portal, where the villain forces you to incinerate the cube? When you think about this, you're taking away player autonomy and forcing them to do things. How can this ever be nonlinear? The answer is to make the entire scene optional. Like, maybe it's something that happens only if you're captured. Once you're captured, you're on rails for a bit, but you don't need to be captured in the first place. So every example I've given so far can be reduced to a single dramatic moment where something happens in gameplay and is immediately linked to a piece of narrative. What about an emotion that takes time to build up? For example, the loneliness that you get in games where there's just nobody around that you can talk to. Now, first things first, before asking how to extend this to nonlinear narratives, we need to tie the game mechanical loneliness into a narrative. Portal, once again, gives us a fairly good example where not only are you lonely, you know who to blame. There's this robot running tests on you like a lab rat who won't let you leave. Not only that, it's malicious. The robot knows you want to leave and won't let you. In order to pull off this kind of loneliness in a non-linear setting, you have to make an isolated section of the game that's all going to obey the same rules. You have to decide, from the moment you set foot on this island, you lose all radio contact with your allies. And sure, maybe you don't need to set foot on the island at all. Maybe there's multiple routes you can go once you get to the island, but you need a section of your game where the game mechanics reinforce emotion consistently, regardless of player path. There's also potential for going the other way around in a non-linear story, of dynamically detecting a loss of autonomy, competence, or relatedness, and then harnessing that emotion. For instance, noticing the player is frustrated, maybe they can't beat a boss, and turning that frustration into a plot moment. Now, we get to actually give an example of breaking competence. Breaking competence actually has several pitfalls. The first is a psychological result that people just don't care about competence unless it's the situation where they have autonomy as well. If you force a player into doing something, they're not going to care that much if they fail. Next, feeling like you're terrible at a game makes people want to give up and quit. And if they quit, they never see your wonderful plot moment. Finally, skill levels vary. Be extremely careful when you create an impossible task that people are meant to fail. And make sure that people actually do fail it. Let's dive into an example and look at some techniques for solving these issues. This is an image of a board game that Brenda Brathwaite made for her daughter to teach her daughter about what really happened in the slave trade from Africa to America. The Middle Passage. Her daughter had to sail a boat of slaves across the ocean. Now, each turn she rolled a die to see how much food was used on their trip. And she was rolling really high. And she said, "Mommy, if we're not going to make it, what are we going to do?" And her mother replies, "Well, we can keep going and hope that people don't die, or we can put some people in the water." And this had a powerful effect. Suddenly her daughter had a much deeper understanding of the historical event and started asking all kinds of great questions like, did that really happen? So I could come home one day and you'd be gone? And would we get together again on the other side? All right, let's break down this game design and analyze how it gets around the major pitfalls associated with breaking competence. How does Brenda's game make sure that the player retains autonomy? She gives the player choices during failure. Her daughter has two terrible options, drowning or starvation, but she has autonomy. In fact, this is the most autonomy she's had since they loaded up the boats. And this is really noteworthy. Most games, when you're not going to make it, do the exact opposite. They take away player autonomy. Your buttons don't even do anything. Your screen fades to gray. Taking away autonomy makes sure you don't care about failing. And these games don't want you to care about failing. This is exactly the opposite of Brenda's game. Brenda wants her daughter to care about failing. How does Brenda's game deal with players of higher skill level? Luck. Brenda's game is not a game where you can sail through every time without problems. Eventually, if you play this game enough, you're going to run into a crisis situation where you have run out of food and you will have to make some hard decisions. How does Brenda's game deal with people who want to give up and quit? Brenda's game has a GM who can respond at the perfect time, right before the player quits the game out of frustration. Now, okay, obviously that's not an option for most of us making electronic games. In electronic games, we basically need to do the same thing we've been doing for years. Guess what the player is feeling. It also helps to just drag the seed out. Make sure that the player can see their impending game mechanical doom coming a mile away while they struggle against it. So how could we modify Brenda's game? Now, don't get me wrong, I happen to think Brenda's game design here is quite brilliant, but not everyone is making a game about historical atrocities. Let's say we wanted to modify this game to have a more positive spin. How would we go about doing that? You could get rescued by another captain. Now, think back to every rescue scene you've come across in a game. Chances are you barely remember them. You feel like you didn't need rescuing and could have fought those enemies off on your own. Take away player competence first, however, and then players tend to feel gratitude. We've made the player feel helpless, which means they really want and appreciate help. So, okay, maybe you're thinking of using one or two of these scenes and are now wondering how many of these scenes to use, at what point in the game to use them. Psychology has a few more hints for us. First, don't overuse these techniques. The way human emotions work is that a corresponding chemical is released in the brain. If the brain runs out of that chemical, then you actually can't feel that emotion anymore. This is why people always talk about creating highs and lows in game design, because the human brain literally cannot maintain a constant high state of emotion. And yes, eventually the human brain can refill its chemical supply, but this takes time, and this isn't something you can rely on your player doing. Another interesting psychological result is that human memory is actually very easily overwritten. Instead of remembering what someone's face looked like every day for the past 5 years, you just remember the most recent version, and older versions of the memory literally get overwritten. And this is already known in cinema, where if people like the final scene of a movie, they usually say they like the entire movie. So when sticking in a scene with negative emotions, you usually won't want this to be the final scene of your game. Unless, of course, your goal is to have a sad ending. And actually, there are games that do finish on a sad ending, and a few of them use some of these techniques. Next, note, psychological studies generally point to the presence of autonomy having a larger impact than the presence of either of the other two. So this most likely means that losing autonomy will have the strongest emotional impact of the three. Okay, enough psychological tricks. Let's review the process from start to finish. First, you're going to want to choose a part of the narrative that you want to emotionally enhance. Next, of all the possible emotions you could use, decide which emotion you want to add to the scene. Once you've decided, this emotion will dictate what kind of game design rule you're going to break, be it autonomy, competence, or relatedness. And then you use the emotion created by gameplay to enhance the emotional impact of your narrative. And that summarizes the strategy. At this point, I'd like to open things up for questions. Oh, also, I've been asked to mention that, yes, we are hiring. Okay, let's go to questions.
So how do you explain all of these ideas to your publisher?
Well, I mean, is your publisher pushing you towards having autonomy, competence, relatedness? Like, I mean, if they're not, then you just say, oh, hey, we're going to have, like, you know, a scene with a death in it, and those are really good in movies, right? So they'll be great in games, right? Like.
Well, you're talking about an idea that's possibly alienating for your player base, and therefore alienating your revenue, and that's, you know,
sure.
That's definitely something that they're going to look at. And,
of course.
I mean, is movies probably one of your strongest things that you can use as a common ground to go, look, we've had these tragedies and we've had these upsets, and
I mean, you can also point to other games that do similar things. Like, you can point to Portal and look at how much, you know, the weighted companion cube became like an internet meme, right? Yeah.
Okay, so you were talking about player death and saving them kind of at the end, and how they might be thankful. In the 2008 version of Prince of Persia, Elika would always save the player before they died, and people ended up finding it as something not useful and something they didn't like in the end. They felt it was too easy, and there was never really any sort of punishment for falling. What do you think of that?
Right. Well, I mean, it starts becoming expected after a while, right? Like, the feeling gratitude is part of it. Is like the unexpected part is important. It's not like, okay, I know this is going to happen. It's like, I feel helpless, right? Like, you don't feel helpless if you know that you are going to be saved no matter what, right?
So you think it would have improved it if sometimes she saved you and sometimes she didn't?
possibly. I mean, I haven't actually played the game in question, so. I mean, I think these are things best used sparingly as opposed to your player expects you to always do this. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Do you have more examples of taking away competence from existing games?
Yeah, I mean, like, specifically for the rescue thing, like, Mega Man X has a scene in the very start where you have this enemy that you basically can't beat. And then you get rescued by Zero, and then similarly, I mean, I sort of alluded to it in the picture, but if we scroll back here far enough, but I mean, Super Metroid has you being rescued by a Metroid. And then there's also like, oh gosh, I mean. Brenda Brathwaite has done well. I mean, Brenda Brathwaite's games are just good examples of like they're full of this kind of stuff. But I mean, One Falls for Each of Us was a game where she's talking about the Trail of Tears, and you have to it's a situation where 50,000 Native Americans were displaced from their homes, right? And she actually has 50,000 game pieces, and the first reaction is like, "You want me to move 50,000 game pieces? Are you crazy?" And then it's like, "Oh my God, they had to move 50,000 people. That's crazy, right?" So yeah, I should have just kept a note of like I mean I went into this with like 50 examples and I pared it down to like 3. So go ahead.
In terms of taking
Autonomy?
Autonomy, thank you. Sorry, But taking away from the player, is it? Do you think there's a key difference between taking it away so much that it's a cut scene versus literally barring off all their options that it's the only thing that they can do, but they still have to do it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a huge difference between that. Like forcing the player to incinerate the Cuban portal would be an extremely different scene if that was an FMV where it's just like, oh, why is the main character doing that? That's not what I would have done, right? Like,
although sometimes it can be just as effective. I can think of one game. So maybe for your next speech, would you kindly mention BioShock in it?
Yeah, no, and there's tons of games I could mention, of course, but yes.
I just wanted to mention that you were talking about competence in games and people wanting an example. A great example is Heavy Rain, when you have the option of killing the drug dealer. If you kill the drug dealer, you are in his child's room, and therefore, if you kill him, you are incompetent as a parent and human being, as a moral human being. However, if you let him go, you do not get the information that you need in order to save your own son. So, no matter what, you make a decision in which you are not competent.
Huh. Go ahead.
One thing I had a question about was the types of scene where you're in an unwinnable situation is sort of a convention you see a lot in, say, JRPGs.
Right.
Very frequently you'll find there's a boss fight somewhere that
it's just a plot fight.
to move the plot forward, and quite often the player actually knows they have to lose. Like it's usually really obvious that the level gap is just so disparate.
Right.
And does that take away from the ability to evoke emotion when you know, like,
when
I better not waste my potions because this is when I have to lose?
Yeah, when you know it's just a scripted sequence, then I mean, absolutely that takes away from emotion, or like even just in JRPGs, if you're like, I mean, half the time when you play them, you're suspicious, like, is this fight a plot fight or is it not, right? So, I mean, it's more effective than when, like you legitimately feel like I should be winning this. Why am I not winning this? Like,
But then you run the risk. Then you run the risk that players quit because they think, oh, I must have done something wrong.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you have to be careful to save them at the right time or cut off the scene at the right time. Right.
Cool. Thank you.
Hey, you probably knew I was coming to the mic.
Yes, I knew you were coming to the mic.
So Scott Wrigley from Immersive. Since one of our guidelines is autonomy, I love the fact that there's a talk on breaking the guidelines because it's all about it. To the question about I thought there were a lot of interesting points. Two things I wanted to mention. One is that autonomy is technically not just about choice, but volition. And so one thing that we find, and we found this, I think I mentioned this to you yesterday in Uncharted 2, that because you do a lot of things where like people are betraying each other and a lot of nasty stuff. One of the things is that emotional stuff gets people really engaged in the story. And so even though, they feel very volitional about moving forward, even if their choice is taken away. And so actually, the autonomy scores are maintained by that sense of volition.
Right.
But another thing I wanted to mention just as an example is Left 4 Dead, where you really talk about getting your competence taken away and your autonomy is when you're incapacitated. Those are some of the most terrifying moments I've ever had. That's why I didn't play for very long. It's too scary. But when that NPC comes along and saves you, we actually have done measurements where you see this real surge in relatedness.
Right, of course.
Because you matter. So there's actually this, it's almost like there's one need being traded off for another.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of these cases, like at least the positive ones, maybe not Brenda Brathwaite's board games, but the positive ones, you generally, like maybe you're losing in one area, but you're gaining in somewhere else. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, thank you, everyone, and don't forget to fill out your reviews that will be sent to you through email.